Hey everyone, welcome back to another Reed Makes video. In this video, I'll be making a Star Wars diorama set on the planet Endor. This diorama is inspired by the 6th Star Wars film, Return of the Jedi, and the iconic battles reimagined in Star Wars Battlefront 2. After cutting out some foam core, I then scraped off the paper layer on the surface, and then glued it on to my picture frame base. The layout for this diorama is going to have a cliff section in the back and 3 redwood trees placed throughout. The Empire will be coming in from this corner, with the Rebels coming in from this side. I began to build up the back of the cliff section with some XPS foam. I started by bulking out the cliff with some larger pieces, and then came back with my knife and carved out a slope. I then added some smaller bits to make the rock look a bit more natural. I then brought the X-Acto knife back out and carved out more pieces. With the carving complete, I can now cover it with some plaster. I mixed together some plaster, paint, Mod Podge, and a little bit of water to create my texture paste. I then poured it onto the diorama and spread it all over. While the rock was drying, I then brought out my 3D printer and prepped it to print the minis. To print my minis, I'm using an Anycubic Photon Mono 4K printer, and I'm using their Eco UV resin. These miniatures usually take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours to print. Occasionally when I'm printing these minis, some of them don't always print out the way you want to. In this case, my Darth Vader miniature turned out a little flat. I take this little scalpel and kind of pry them off the printing base. As I was cleaning up the vat, I found Darth Vader. Next, I began cleaning the miniatures and pulling them off all of their supports. After I washed them with some isopropyl alcohol, I then used this little makeshift UV lamp and cured them. Off camera, I printed out a new Darth Vader, and he turned out great. I placed all the miniatures on these stands and then took them outside to spray paint. With all the miniatures primed, I can now start to paint them. For my painting, I'm using the Army Painter's War Paints and Speed Paints. For Darth Vader, I started with a mixture of ultramarine blue and matte black. I then added matte white to my base coat to make it lighter and lighter as I progressed in highlights. For all the leather pieces, I added a little strip of pure white on the edge and blended it back with the base coat color. I wanted to try to do some non-metallic metal, so for all of Darth Vader's metal armor pieces, I started with some pure white on the edge and then went back with some black and grays to shade it in. I also took some pure white and added some little areas of reflection on each side of Darth Vader's helmet. After all the highlighting was done, I painted Darth Vader's lights and eyes. Next, I painted the Stormtroopers. I primed them in white, and then I painted all of their under armor in black. After the Stormtroopers, I then painted the Ewoks with different mixtures of speed paints. I really like using the speed paints on the furry textures as it sets into the recesses quite nicely. I painted each of their little hoods a different color of like a red, orangey yellow. And with the Ewoks finished, I can move on to painting Luke Skywalker. I started by giving Luke the same base coat color as Darth Vader's armor. I changed up the paint on his boots and added a bit of green to hopefully simulate a bit of green reflection from the ferns and grass. I mixed a bit of pure red into the flesh tone and then worked my way back up with some highlights. I used some more speed paint over Luke's hair to help with the recesses. And then I painted Luke's robes with the same series of highlights as I did Darth Vader. With all my mini painting done, I then cut off Darth Vader's lightsaber and gave him and Luke both LED lightsabers. Now I'm going to start working on the trees for the diorama. I'm going to be making these tall redwood trees that are iconic to the Endor forest. After tapering one end, I then glued on triangle pieces of foam to bulk out the trunk. Then I brought out my X-Acto knife and blended it all together. I went outside and collected some sticks, and after disinfecting them, I picked out the best ones for the branches. To add the branches, I poked a little hole with this sculpting tool, and then added a bit of PVA glue, and then pressure fitted the branches in. Next, I spent countless hours adding all of these little skewers and toothpicks to create the platforms. I wanted to have one tree with a platform that wrapped all the way around it, and another one with a staircase that led up to the platform. After all the toothpicks were added, I then added my texture paste all over these trees to hold them together and give them more strength. When the texture paste had sort of half dried, I then took an X-Acto and carved in the bark lines. After it fully dried, I then added this little railing around the platform and then another railing around the staircase. As I was building these, I noticed that I could build a little bridge between them, so I decided to take this popsicle stick and then cut it in half to create the braces for the bridge. To help make the bridge, I added some double-sided tape onto my hobby mat, and then I stuck the popsicle sticks onto the double-sided tape. I put some tacky glue onto the popsicle sticks, and then I added all of these little skewers to make the bridge. I added a little railing to the bridge to match the rest of the platforms, and then I took some oil washes to stain the wood. Next, it was time to start painting the trees, so I kind of used this little leopard spotting technique and added different shades of brown all over the tree. Once the first layer of paint was dried, I then took out my airbrush and added some more acrylic paint. And then finally, I dry brushed with a lighter tan. Next, I wanted to add a bit more of a sandy texture to the bottom of the diorama, so I added sand to my texture paste and spread it all over the base. I also added the same mixture to the bottom of the trees to help secure them onto the base. Then I painted the rest of the diorama with this same darker green. With the base drying, I now can work on the foliage for the trees. I took some pieces of wire and then spread out each little strand to act as the branches. I painted over them with a mixture of brown paint and PVA glue, and then dipped the tips in some PVA glue and added in some steel wool. The steel wool will give the flocking a good base to glue onto. I added some more glue to the steel wool, and then I took the whole branch and stuffed it into the bag of flocking. And then I repeated that process probably about 50 or so more times. I then secured the branches with some UV resin. For the ground cover, I decided to use this bag of sawdust. Sawdust doesn't really have a very uniform texture, so I thought it would be good to create that messy forest look. I added in some red and brown paint to help it look more like dried pine needles and branches. I then spread it across a baking sheet and let it dry for a couple days. And then once it was dried, I spread some PVA glue on the base and then sprinkled it all over the base. And then I secured it with some isopropyl alcohol. Next, I'm going to be working on the ferns. I got all my material from Diorama Presepe. After picking out some of my favorite pieces, I then cut them down and cut out this little piece of wire for the stem. And then I glued them together with some UV resin. I'm using this other box from Diorama Presepe for the other smaller trees. The pieces are pretty fragile, so I had to be quite careful as I was working with them. And shockingly, I used UV resin to secure these ones as well. And then off camera, I made two more. I wasn't super happy with how the foliage on the larger redwood trees turned out, but I found this lichen foliage from Woodland Scenics, and I thought it looked great. So I placed little clumps all over the tree branches. And then I also added some lower hanging branches underneath. Before adding all the new foliage, I added these toothpicks to help blend the platform into the ground. I also added some moss onto the trees and then also onto the rocks. I poked little holes all around the base and then added in some PVA glue and then pushed the trees into place. I added in all my little ferns. And then I added these little tufts from gamer's grass. I also added more dead branches and sticks all throughout. I speckled on a bit of glue and then sprinkled on some moss. And then finally, it was time to place the miniatures. I pulled out these little plugs so that I could run the wires for both Luke and Darth Vader's lightsabers. And then I secured my 3 little Ewoks in place. I wanted to add some final little details to the platforms, so I made this little animal skin along with other vases and baskets to go on top of the platforms. With the final details added, the diorama was finished. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a great week, and if you haven't seen it yet, this is my previous video where I make a sandstorm diorama. Oh, and may the 4th be with you.